In advance of the screening of His Girl Friday on Saturday in the IFI at 12 p.m. and the following panel discussion after the chick flick Female Identities in Hollywood Film, I'm here with Professor Diane Negra, and we're just going to have a chat about the upcoming event. So first of all, Diane, thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure.
So the decision to choose His Girl Friday, which best described as a screwball comedy, what would you think that says about where we are in terms of chick flicks at the moment, and what chick flicks are in relation to this, I suppose?
It's obviously a long reach back historically, and we had a lot of discussions, some of the IFI staff and myself, about what would be a good film to kind of partner with the discussion that we're going to have. And we opted for His Girl Friday partly because it's an extraordinarily important film, and I think it not only for various reasons in terms of the personnel associated with it, the kind of generic qualities it has, but because it reflects an era in which arguably, and I think this is very much an arguable point, the chick flick was smarter than it is now. And one of the things I mean by that is that there's a real sense in that film, which is a classic battle of the sexist narrative in one way, is that romance has to be egalitarian. And I think that idea has largely faded away in the current cinema. So my sense is that it's interesting to go back and view a film from, let's say the mid-20th century, when it was fairly customary for films to think about romance in these ways. And my argument would be that certainly, let's say since the 1990s, we haven't had egalitarian romances in abundance. We tend to have romances that are skewed in a certain way. We have a harder time culturally thinking of romance as a battle of equals or a coming together of equals or whatever you like.
And where it ends now as well, I suppose that there was always this direction towards marriage or couples that were separated that would come back together. And where we are now, marriage isn't very high on people's list, and is that going to be reflected then in our idea of romantic movies and where things are headed, I suppose?
Well, I suppose one of the things that's interesting about when you go back to these earlier sort of classic women's films as they were then known, sometimes we're surprised by how relatively progressive they are. But you're right that certainly in the 1930s there were these two famous cycles of screwball comedy. One were the comedies of commitment, so-called, and then the comedies of reaffirmation, in which a wrongly separated couple has to come back together, and the machinations for them doing so what makes the film interesting. It's certainly the case that marriage is no longer as much of a focus. But in the recent past, I would argue, see, for me, I think there's a really important pivot that happens if you want to historicize the chick flick. And for us in the contemporary period, that moment is the late 80s, and that's when you get some really big hits. You get the rise of female auteurs like Nora Ephron. And I think the success of films like When Harry Met Sally and Broadcast News, Pretty Woman, later Sleepless in Seattle, these films lock in place a formula that actually was, some people would call it pretty dedicated to the matrimonial industrial complex. Even if we didn't see a wedding take place, we expected that one would. But of course, there are numerous bridal films that, particularly as we kind of, progress from the 90s into the noughties, that becomes a pretty regulation element in the genre. Now, in whatever period we now find ourselves, where the chick flick has lost some of its commercial viability, seemingly, although I think there are some important exceptions. And we can see that social norms are shifting as well in some interesting ways. So the purpose of the event that we're holding at the IFI on Saturday is to examine and think about not only the historical roots of the contemporary chick flick via His Girl Friday, but also to say, what is the post-epitaph chick flick, right? Because we know that there's so often these kind of gleeful epitaphs that are written for the genre. And so we're asking, well, hang on a minute, there's still chick flicks being produced. What are their characteristics? What do they do? What kinds of pleasures do audiences get from them? But it's clear, I think, that we're in a post-peak moment, that the genre was definitely more successful, let's say, a decade ago,
and it's trying to re-identify itself and repackage itself in a way, and this idea of millennials, I suppose, always comes into it is an ironic enjoyment of media rather than engaging in it emotionally as would have been expected. Like, I mean, when you move through things like melodrama and chick flicks, they always had a slightly melodramatic edge to them, and lessons being taught, and that doesn't seem to be the focus anymore as much. I mean, overtly, but there's always this kind of undercurrent. I mean, you still see in more recent films that the women are taught a lesson in a way, and either that's to do with work, or it's to do with motherhood, or it's to do with their ability to love, or ability to have a loving relationship with somebody. And there's still that it still does reduce down to that definition. For me anyway, I don't know if that's...
No, I think what you're describing is very recognizable.
Yeah.
And I think it is hard because we are in a sort of blurred moment where, the chick flick is certainly pronounced dead on a regular basis, and yet there are chick flicks out there. And I think you're right that this is one of the things that's playing out is an uncertainty about partly exactly what you said. How does this genre speak to younger audiences in an era of digital romance, and that's probably dignifying in a certain way. But and certainly 20 years of a pornified culture in which pornography has been largely destigmatized. All of the sort of older courtship rituals that let's say drove the genre are largely in decline. So how does this kind of story type speak to a new audience? If I had an answer to that question, I'd probably be doing rather well. but I do think this period of uncertainty is interesting in its own right.
It is, yeah.
As you say, there's a kind of weird shift in tone, and as you say, a loss of sincerity on the one hand, a rise in cynicism. And I think, a big hit that we've seen this year is Trainwreck. And Trainwreck really personifies this because, let's say for 80% of the film, it has this acerbic tone, and its protagonist, played by Amy Schumer, of course, is a model of cynicism and pessimism. And the joke of the film is that she is playing by the rules of a single man in an urban environment, right? And the flip side of that is that we get the basketball star LeBron James playing the role of the sort of, the friend who's concerned about the emotional stakes in this romance for his male friend. So and that's, I think, very successful.
Yeah.
But then the film inevitably has to achieve what I think is a very unpersuasive shift at the end, where, just as you say, the female protagonist has to learn something.
Yeah.
And of course she has to learn to be more conventionally feminine, and she has to be more conventionally
emotionally available.
Yeah, that's a big part of it, for sure. And she has to disaffiliate. I mean, one of the things interesting about that film, I think, is that she's presented as damaged by her father.
Yeah.
And that affiliation with a male character who the film sees as too influential upon her has damaged her, and she has to recover some more recognizable femininity.
Yeah, and it actually, when I was watching it, and I thought it was quite good, and it was well written, but it did remind me for some reason of in Working Girl, Harrison Ford's character, when he first sees Melanie Griffith's character, and he says, you look like a woman you look like a woman, not you're not dressed as a man would dress if he was a woman. You're dressed as a woman. And for me, that was sort of how Trainwreck wrapped itself up, is that throughout it she was supposed to be behaving like a man, but eventually she learned how to put herself in this cloak of womanhood and look like a woman and seem like a woman in her intimacy issues. And so it's slight cop out, I suppose, but the happy ending is where it's at with chick flicks, really.
It's hard to think of many chick flicks that don't pay off in that way, although that's a bit of a spoiler, but His Girl Friday probably doesn't. But I feel like we're always looking for chick flicks that are more textured in their emotional kind of affective character, and films that give us really meaningful, in some ways true to life experiences of intimacy. And the chick flick hasn't done that terribly well. But, and this is the reason I think why it deserves our attention, it is still our premier genre of intimacy, and it has for 25 years, if you accept my argument that it's in the late 80s that it really finds its modern form, that for 25 years it has been a very significant kind of both reflection and source of how we imagine men and women, and it still is almost always men and women rather than men and men, women and women, find each other and achieve workable, intimacies. Yeah. So despite the many disappointments that the genre gives us, I think there's a lot of work to do around it, and it deserves our thoughtfulness rather than just, as the term itself implies, a kind of standard pejorative dismissal. Yeah. And that, I think, is one of the functions of the event on Saturday. Yeah.
I mean, the term seems pejorative. Like, I mean, when you hear it, you immediately think a certain type of movie that has a certain class, a level of entertainment that is probably on the lower end of the art scale when you're considering them. But I mean, it is, like you say, it is still where we see gender roles being played out, and we see, you know, what are being told, and by repetition what are being told in every film. Are we being constantly told that the fulfillment for a woman is, you know, this romantic life, or
right.
you know, reconnecting with this and as you have said before, a retreatist fantasy, where you're heading away from all these troubles of the world. And during a recessionary time, that sort of becomes more important, because women, we're the first to be hit in everything. You know, women and children are the first to be hit in cuts and in employment, and you know, we're predominantly part-time workers, things like that. So it's important to see how we're being represented in these types of films as consumers, and also as you know, just as a part of the whole mechanism.
Yeah,
you know?
No, I couldn't agree more. And I do think that, you know, the seriousness of the chick flick really lies in the way in which it does influence cultural norms. And you're right that the chick flick had this long established, by that I mean sort of since the late 80s, tendency to commit to what I call the retreatist plot, in which a woman unlearns feminism, right? She's typically a sort of, you know, a go-getting, young, urban professional, and by the end of the film, in some way, she has realized that what she thought she wanted was wrong. And, you know, You've Got Mail is such a perfect example. You know, it really typifies the genre on so many levels. And so, you know, in that case, where Meg Ryan's protagonist, Kathleen Kelly, is actually put out of business by the man she falls in love with, we have this incredibly stark illustration of kind of the new voraciousness of capitalism. And I saw a film this week that interested me very much, called The Mermaid, which is doing extremely well in China. You could see it here in Cineworld, just up the street. And it is a rendition of You've Got Mail, in the sense that like that film, it requires its female protagonist to help make capitalism a little bit better, symbolically, right? Because the mermaid kind of love interest, you know, is sort of an eco-warrior, if you like. And so the marriage that concludes, the romance that concludes the film, and just as in You've Got Mail about 17 years ago, includes the slight recalibrating of some of the kind of the toughest aspects of capitalism. So I think when we look at couples in chick flicks over and over and over again, they're not just two people coming together. They're social problems that are symbolized by the coming together of these two people, and you can play that out with greater and lesser degrees of subtlety and delicacy. The Mermaid is not a particularly subtle film, but it's very
wasn't I?
Fair point. But it speaks of issues that I think preoccupy many people in China and beyond China too, about the environment, about the effect that a kind of unfettered capitalism has on the environment, etc. So again, we see that the chick flick is not telling these kind of isolated tales of people who you know, meet and form some sort of relationship that normally has to be considered permanent. There are also films that are sort of testing other other kinds of ideological precepts at the same time. Yeah,
which I think, you know, you can even see echoed in the advertising at the moment, things like that. Large corporations are really anxious to appear small, pastoral. You know, they're your corner shop now. It's your bank on the corner, rather than this huge conglomeration, because the tide has turned against that you know, against this ultra capitalist way that we were living. You know, or has it? I mean, you know, there's so much in that.
Or at least there's an awareness that there might be some public, you know, disquiet about, you know, the rise of corporate power. And but I do think that the romance has pretty consistently tested capitalism in various ways. Now, the tests that it has carried out are usually kind of set aside to achieve a kind of, you know, a typical and expected closure. But nevertheless, and you know, there are different critics who've written really well about this and argue that the chick flick, you know, one of its you know, worrying qualities is its tendency to produce these hollow endings that really just don't fool anybody. And that might be a useful response to the chick flick, is that, you know, it doesn't it's obliged to go through certain rote narrative maneuvers, but it knows that at some level they're unconvincing. So in a way, unlike perhaps other genres of film, the closure that's achieved is cosmetic, and it may be that a certain perhaps even rather high percentage of the audience knows that, expects that, and yet the richer stuff comes much earlier in the film.
I mean, it wasn't fantastic, but they came together. I don't know, did you see that? You know, that was sort of it was a complete riff on the entire thing. But it's such an easy thing to do because the tropes are there and everybody knows the stereotypes are there. Now, it wasn't fantastic overall, the movie, but it did give you the sort of step by step. You know, they meet each other, they hate each other straight away, and then they break apart, and then they come back together. So that was a good kind of riff on it. But for me, I feel like a lot of the movies lately have been trying to focus more on female to female relationships, and that is the new way that we're trying to read our chick flicks in
definitely
in a way
I think that is definitely a trend that we've seen over the past 3, 4, 5 years where and there's a film in theaters now, How to Be Single, that I think really typifies this, where there's another interesting thing about How to Be Single, which is not a good film, and I'll just sort of say it outright, but it comes from this interesting little mini tradition that really is associated with the director Gary Marshall, where he makes these what I call compendium romances, Valentine's Day, New Year's Eve, and these films don't have the confidence to commit to a protagonist couple, so they hedge their bets and they give us lots of characters. And on a smaller scale, that's what How to Be Single does. And then at the same time, just as you say, it closes on this kind of note of celebration of the beauty and the value and the necessity of female friendship as a durable, kind of element, or, kind of social experience when the romantic kind of environment is destabilized and uncertain. So I think it's completely true, and I think there's an interesting span of these films, and some of them are quite they're subversive. They're really rich and interesting texts, and so I think that's probably emerged in the last 5 years as one of the most important new aspects. And when I say that these films are committed to female friendship, I don't necessarily mean in the older way that, let's say, Steel Magnolias or some of the films of the 90s tended to have a pretty saccharine, kind of rendition of female friendship. These films are a little more tough-minded, perhaps, but they really value the notion of an intimacy in women's lives which isn't necessarily exclusively about heterosexual romance.
Yeah. Well, I could talk about this forever, but I think we should probably call it quits there. Really looking forward to the event on Saturday, and there are tickets still available, so hopefully people will come out.
I hope they will.
For an interesting discussion.
And a good film too.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah.